Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to start with a bit of a cliché, and you've probably heard this one. The one about the Eskimo words for snow. And that's because for decades now there's been this myth that Eskimos have 50 words for snow. And while for many decades, a lot of linguists and a lot of scientific skeptics referred to this as a kind of a great Eskimo vocabulary hoax. Or basically they argued that it was just a misunderstanding of how those languages are built. Although here, just to clarify myself and I guess maybe apologize, using the word Eskimo here is actually not very appropriate. And that's because it's a historical term that basically described a lot of different indigenous people living in the Arctic. And they do speak different languages and do have slightly different lifestyles. But the main point in this case still kind of stands. The idea was that their languages are just different, and so they do not have 50 words for snow. But turns out, based on some of the most recent research, and also this really cool website that I'm going to show you very soon, there might be a lot more truth to all of this, with this potentially being true for a lot of different cultures on the planet, with many different cultures possessing at least a few concepts that seem to have a much larger number of words describing something very specific. And so according to new research published in 2025 and 2026, and by using a massive dataset and machine learning, which allowed researchers to analyze hundreds of different languages, scientists have now discovered that in many different cases our vocabulary is not just a random list of words, but seems to precisely mirror our cultural needs and the environments where we usually live. With this particular website that you can find in the description, allowing all of us to basically explore how different cultures and how different languages seem to overrepresent certain concepts. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. But let's start with that snow, because we need to explore this argument in order for all of this to make sense. And so for a very long time, it was actually believed that languages like the Inuktitut and Yupik only seem to have more words for certain concepts like snow because they add suffixes to a single root word. Or basically, it's the same word, but it just has slightly different conjugation, and thus might appear to be overrepresented compared to other words. But by studying 616 languages using a new dataset referred to as BILA, Bilingual Lexicon Assembly, researchers did confirm that certain languages, like the Inuit languages, seem to actually be quite unique after all. And so out of all of those hundreds of different languages that you can actually explore here, the Eastern Canadian Inuktitut language seemed to come out on top for the vocabulary involving snow. Although in this case, the number of words referring to snow was closer to 20. In contrast, as you can see right here, the word kayak, caribou, and parka seem to be much more numerous, with the word kayak being expressed in 40 different ways. But I'm sure you'll be just as surprised to find out that the next culture on the list when it comes to snow is actually Japanese. And so here, as you can see on the list, Japanese and Mandarin Chinese languages also seem to have several different ways of expressing snow. And so many of these languages distinguish between things like wet snow, that's usually used for example, ice sleighs, and crystalline powder snow, which usually looks like salt. And so here, as you can see, this is not just about being in the Arctic. As a matter of fact, Scotland, or Scots, also ranked in the top 10, with terms like footer for a slight fall of snow and fudum for snow drifting at intervals. And if you're Scottish watching this, feel free to leave your angry complaints about how I totally mispronounced all of these words. But in essence, all of this tells us that if your daily survival depends on some kind of a substance or some kind of a specific understanding, your language is going to evolve to be much more detailed in that specific area. And so I've actually spent quite a few hours on this website trying to explore how different cultures express themselves and trying to understand why certain words seem to have the most prevalence. So for example, living in South Korea, I wanted to find out, what about Korean? And here I was kind of surprised, but also maybe not really surprised, to find out that the top words were more or less bureaucratic. For example, words like graduate, examination, candidate, minister, grade, scholar, promotion. Although surprisingly, the number one word seems to be station. But for anyone living in Korea, this kind of makes sense. Lots of different bureaucracy in this country. Then I was quite surprised to find out that the word love, or anything to do with love, was not even remotely on the list when it comes to the French language. So next time someone tells you that French is the language of love, basically point them to this list. In contrast, the top 10 words include things like cable, card, and stamp. And honestly, this was a bit of a shock and still kind of does not really make a lot of sense to me. As a matter of fact, the word wine is not even in top 10. And so check out this website in the link in the description, try it out, and let me know what unusual facts you find out about the language that you might speak as well. Like for example for French, I still don't understand why cable. But in some sense this also brings us to the next study and the idea referred to as lexical elaboration. Or a fancy way of saying that a language has a lot of words for a specific topic. And this is usually not just about weather or what you see around you. For example, Hindi seems to have an unusually high number of words related to love. So yeah, it's not French. While Japanese does have a lot of terms for obligation and duty. Whereas in the Pacific Islands, researchers looked at the oceanic languages and found something they had not expected. A massive vocabulary for smells. For example, the language referred to as Marshallese has very specific words for the smell of damp clothing, jatbo, and the smell of blood, mela. Once again, if I mispronounce your language, leave your angry rants in the comments. But why is this important? Well, first of all, this suggests that a language is a kind of a biological fossil record of previous human experience. So basically here, if we see a language with 180 words for ice, like the Sami languages in Scandinavia, we know that understanding ice seems to be a critical part of their cultural history and survival. With this other new study you can find in the description, essentially discovering something else by using a different technique in machine learning. Here they mapped out semantic space of 22 different languages, which represents a mathematical map where words of similar meanings are placed close together. And they essentially found 4 universal patterns. Patterns that seem to exist in pretty much most languages on the planet. First one is the frequency associativity, or essentially the idea of popular or high-frequency words, such as the word the or the word water, clustering together in a kind of a mathematical space, while some of the more rare words seem to have their own little neighborhoods. Then, number 2 is the clustering velocity. Languages organize words into different hierarchical structures, with these relatively broad concepts being broken down into specific subclusters. And so this speed of breaking down different concepts seems to be identical in different human cultures. Number 3 is punctuated bursts, or basically that language evolution is not slow and steady, and instead seems to actually evolve in bursts with new words appearing very suddenly and in relatively large numbers, which is very similar to how the actual biological evolution happens as well, with organisms very often evolving in these very fast bursts. And lastly, number 4 is the Taylor's law, a mathematical rule that's usually found in ecology or physics, but also applies to words, and it shows that patchiness or clumpiness of new words seems to have a kind of a predictable power law dynamics, with researchers even discovering these hotspots and cold spots for different vocabularies, or essentially these concepts in the vocabulary, where words seem to appear much more often, for example in concepts like technology, and other concepts where words almost never appear. So this is basically a more stable area where the vocabulary doesn't change much for decades. And what's really fascinating is that these patterns seem to be very consistent and seem to be universal to most languages, with scientists even actually being able to create a synthetic language using a simple mathematical model. Or essentially they can create a kind of a fake language that behaves almost exactly like a real human language. In other words, here, by using statistical analysis, scientists once again confirm that most languages seem to have almost identical rules and seem to follow a relatively similar strategy. But I guess the question is, what have we actually learned from this, and why does this mathematical structure matter? Well, first, this actually helps us understand how we as humans think. And so if every human language follows the same statistical rules, it suggests that there are these hidden patterns that seem to govern how we invent new ideas. Second, this also potentially allows us to predict how different cultures change. And so by looking at different hotspots and these new words appearing and forming inside specific themes, we can then start to understand what a certain culture seems to value in real time. For example, in smaller societies, there is very often a huge elaboration of words for dance, which reflects the importance for social cohesion and social interaction in a lot of these communities. In contrast, like I mentioned, different concepts in technology seem to be extremely prevalent in a lot of bigger languages, because as you can imagine, technology is right now at the forefront of everyone's attention. But at the same time, this finally settles this debate, because now we actually have physical data and mathematical analysis to definitively suggest that culture and the environment do shape the language in every region on the planet. And so whether it's 20-something words for snow, or different unusual ritual words for rain in different locations in South Africa, our vocabulary or our words record what the culture needs to survive. And so at least for now, that's essentially all I wanted to cover. Go check out this website in the description and let me know what you discover. And on that note, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.